Well now, would you look at that video title? It certainly looks like I'm back to talking about one of my usual haunts now, doesn't it? Though to be fair to myself, the last time I discussed a character from SMITE, it was 6 episodes ago, and that translates to nearly 2 years of real-world time, so that's an acceptable cop-out for not taking the opportunity to branch out into a new video game or series, yeah? In the time since I talked about Chernobog's origins in detail, SMITE has added several more pantheons, like ones based on Arthurian lore and the literature of H.P. Lovecraft. But that's not the focus for today. Rather, today's subject character comes from something that's been around much longer, in both the game's history and history in general. The Egyptian Pantheon, which has much more variety on display and could lead to many good episodes. Tasked with such a decision, I woke up and chose violence. The god of violence, that is. And also storms, deserts, disorder, foreigners, and sometimes darkness. Oh yes, we're talking about Set today. Today's episode was one of several ideas suggested by DN Prime 17, a regular contributor in our cozy little Discord hangout, and I'm glad you made that suggestion because it's been a long while since I brought up anything related to the Land of the Nile. You know, good old Dinsiscent Sphered. Among the gods of the ancient Egyptian pantheon, Set really stands out, and it's because of that bold claim that I'm a little surprised it's taken me this long to make a video dedicated to one of his portrayals in the medium of video games. SMITE in particular released Set at the same time as Horus, and also heavily references their rivalry, so while I could have attempted to make this episode about both of their portrayals here, Horus is by far the more well-known of the two in popular culture, whereas Set's image is one rooted in a number of misunderstandings and complicated history, so talking about him on his own gives me more room to focus on that. Better to be comfortable in my ramblings instead of forcibly restrained, after all. My name is Sherry, and I'll be your designated talekeeper as we discuss an ancient Egyptian god with a distinctively complicated reputation, and whether SMITE's portrayal of Set attempts to show some of the hidden good in his history, or continues the popular image of an evil god of disorder, betrayal, and strife. So get out your pencils, trivia enthusiasts, because this is character development. Even by the standards of the not very standardized ancient Egyptian pantheon, Set is a bit of an enigma within a puzzle, and trying to properly understand him is something that both popular media and academic sources have long struggled with. Like many other ancient Egyptian deities, his name has more than one accepted interpretation, so while I'm using Set as SMITE calls him, you should know that he also goes by Sutekh, and, more interestingly, Seth. So congratulations to all the Seths that are watching this video. You're named after the Egyptian god of disorder, storms, and deserts. Or maybe that's just a coincidence because there's also the third son of Adam and Eve named Seth, but hey, that's your agency, not mine. I'll leave it up to you to decide your etymology, resident Seths in the audience. If you were to put together the various stories about Set, you'd quickly see that they paint a larger image of moral grayness, with perspectives varying based on the time period of the source material, as well as who wrote it. Sometimes Set plays a positive role in the affairs of the gods and was seen as a necessary part of the natural order, but more popularly than not, he's understood as a very evil figure, associated with aspects like violence, disorder, trickery, and darkness. Even the animal representing Set isn't entirely clear. It could be a fictional creature of some kind, but it's much more likely to be a combination of parts from different animals. Having the canine body shape of a jackal, the long curved snout of an aardvark, the erect ears of a donkey, and an unnatural forked tail, it certainly befits a cunning god with many faces and a variable reputation. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's go back to that moral grayness I mentioned. In the years of ancient Egypt's first golden age, better known as the Old Kingdom, Set was recognized as a guardian of the pharaohs, some of whom even adopted Set's name and image as a mark of patronage. He also played a key role in the slaying of Apep, the giant serpent of chaos whose existence endangered the natural order of the world by threatening to plunge everything into eternal darkness. As time went on, Set's name and image took on a more negative connotation, and the stories that were told about him often focused on the relationship he had with his brother Osiris, as well as his eventual nephew, Horus. The most famous of these involved Set's deep jealousy at the success of Osiris's rule, which led him to trick his brother and oust him from power, being ejected from Egypt inside his own coffin. When Set was sure that his brother was dead, he looked for the body and subsequently cut it into pieces, which he scattered all across Egypt. Unbeknownst to Set, Isis, the goddess of healing and the sister wife of Osiris, was able to reassemble and revive her husband, though he was missing a single and very important part of his body: his genitals, which meant that he was ineligible to rule over the land of the living. The land of the dead, though? Not a problem. No cojones required. Yet, despite Osiris no longer having his olive garden, he and Isis were miraculously able to produce a son, the sky god Horus, who sought to avenge his father and restore order by removing Set from power. The two would spend several decades fighting things out in actual combat, as well as through competitions intended to prove which of the two gods was superior and therefore meant to rule over humanity. In an effort to invalidate Set's legitimacy, Horus injured, or even ripped out, one of Set's family jewels. Set responded by tearing out one, or in some versions both, of Horus's eyes. Set also attempted to sexually assault Horus to assert his dominance, and Horus reciprocated by doing some interesting things to a crop of lettuce that was soon given as an offering to Set, which, I'm not entirely sure I can say here on YouTube, but I think you get the idea. What matters is that Horus was eventually declared the victor over Set, the disgraced usurper. So why the dramatic change in perspective, from Set being a protector of the sun and the pharaoh to a jealous, backstabbing tyrant? Well, one plausible theory is that Set was also acknowledged as the god of foreigners, and when Egypt was conquered and ruled by outsiders, such as the Hyksos, Nubians, and Assyrians, many Egyptians would blame Set for their misfortune and the disruption of order. Likewise, when the foreign kings were driven out and Egyptian rule was restored, it was celebrated and likened to the victory of Horus over Set. However, that doesn't mean Set was universally demonized, as he still had an important role to play in the day-to-day maintenance of the world, and there were periods of time when Set's reputation with the Egyptians improved rather than declined. Although Horus became the god of kingship and a deity synonymous with the pharaoh, he mainly ruled over the fertile Black Land on the banks of the Nile River, where crops were grown and the people thrived. Set, on the other hand, ruled over the Red Land that was beyond the Nile, especially in the west. This was where the desert sprawled and the dead were put to rest, because the sun would also die every day when it set in the west. The desert represented death and decay, but it was also understood as Set's barrier that protected Egypt from invasion. In a similar mindset, it was understood that without Set, Osiris would not have become the god of the afterlife, the phases of the moon would not have been created from Horus's injured eye, and the concept of order would not have meaning or significance without disorder to counterbalance it. Plenty of the other gods had their own morally questionable moments too, so it's not like Set was the only one acting up. Taking this process a step further, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom made numerous attempts to redeem Set's image, by praying to him to sow discord within the lands of Egypt's enemies, prominently featuring him in their artwork, and by reasserting the importance of his role in the slaying of Apep. Two pharaohs from Ramses the dynasty were even named Seti in honor of the god, and the dynasty that came after began with a pharaoh named Setnakti. So then, despite these improvements, why did Set's legacy end on such a bad note? The answer to that question is simple. Blame the Greeks. The final nail in Set's coffin was put in place when Alexander of Macedon took control of Egypt from Achaemenid Persia in the 4th century BCE. As it was during the subsequent Ptolemaic period that aspects of Hellenic religion began to blend themselves in with the native Egyptian pantheon. Given his prominence, Set was bound to become one of the many deities affected by this, and he was seen as synonymous with the Greek figure of Typhon. Typhon was not a god, or even a titan, but rather a primordial force of anger and destruction that tried to challenge the gods, only to be defeated by Zeus and sealed away deep underground, where his fury would manifest as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Definitely not the best thing to be compared to, and largely because of it, the popular image of Set was twisted to become the very thing he once swore to destroy, as it largely remains today. Some gods have better fates than others, and Set was not one of them. With that cheery note to end on, that covers the educational portion. Now we can see and discuss how Smite's portrayal of Set compares to his inspiration. Right off the bat, Set's in-game title is the Usurper, and he's classified as an assassin god, meaning that the story of how he overthrew his brother Osiris is central to his characterization. Indeed, it's that and the conflict of succession against Horus, themselves the two most well-known stories involving Set, which are repeated the most with Smite's imagining of the god of disorder. Thankfully, there's more at play than just that, but I'm about to get ahead of myself again, so let's start with the basics and work our way up from there. Looking at Set's design, it's clearly based on traditional images with their mix of human and animal anatomy. Now, this design philosophy is shared with most of the other Egyptian gods in Smite, but Set is a little more grounded, I think is the word I'm looking for. He definitely stands in contrast to gods like Horus, Geb, and Khepri, whose designs take more creative liberty, though this could have been the intent, given his aforementioned rivalry with Horus. Going more in detail, Set's head is meant to be that of a donkey, while his hands and feet have the digits and claws of a jackal, thus representing the two major, commonly agreed upon parts of his mysterious associated animal. But what really gets my attention is the item in Set's hand. Set's weapon of choice is a polearm whose curved blade and pointed base give it a shape similar to a was scepter, a staff that was used in ancient Egyptian art to symbolize power, authority, and dominion. Set was frequently shown carrying one, and the scepter was also clearly modeled after the distinctive head and forked tail of his representative animal. But there also exist plenty of images of other gods, goddesses, pharaohs, and priests holding the was scepter, either because it represented the power of a god like Set, or because it symbolized a figure of order and authority containing disorder within the grip of their hand. Much like Set himself, I suppose it depends on the time period. In terms of gameplay, Set's playstyle revolves around placing copies of himself made from sand by using his Spawn of Set ability, as these effigies provide additional effects to Set's other abilities. Although this definitely isn't what the ability is based on, something I didn't mention in our earlier lecture is that the mythological Set had at least two children with his sister wife Nephthys: Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death and mummification, and Wep-Wawet, a lesser wolf-headed war god. Thankfully, Smite still references this via a special directed taunt that Set has with Anubis, explicitly addressing him as son. I've also seen sources that mention Set being the father of Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of the Nile, but their counterparts in Smite don't have a special interaction like Set and Anubis do. By the look of things, I would instead suggest that Set's Spawn of Set ability is more of a reference to his role as the god of deserts, since his copies are made from sand, and he also has the ability Sandstorm in reference to both that and his further association with storms. His other two abilities, Skewer and Kingslayer, have a common theme of their own, being in reference to Set's conflicts with a seated king, Osiris, and a king claimant, Horus. Though I'd also like to offer an alternate interpretation that Skewer might also be a callback to the slaying of Apep, during which Set stood at the prow of Ra's solar bark, stabbing the Serpent of Chaos through its mouth with a long spear. Rounding out Set's kit is his passive ability, Relentless, which increases his attack speed with each consecutive hit he lands on an enemy, and if that enemy happens to be Horus, the on-screen gauge fills up twice as fast, once again referencing his rivalry with the Sky God. Likewise, Horus's passive ability, Resolute, charges faster when he's damaged by Set, so the two were made to rival each other in gameplay as well as lore. While I have this opportunity, I'd like to bring back the central question of this episode. Does Smite try to portray Set in a more positive light? Well, the answer is sort of, but yes. Smite actually does try to justify Set's actions instead of just making him evil for the sake of being the evil Egyptian god. It's not much, but it can be found in Set's lore description, which details that Egypt under Osiris's rule was not as prosperous as the stories of yore commonly made it out to be, and that the so-called perfect king even withheld the right of succession from his own son. Thus, seeing Egypt's future in danger, Set chose to take matters into his own hands by removing the corrupt monarch as well as his ill-prepared successor, even though he knew he was risking his entire legacy by usurping his brother and nephew. Of course, this is likely being told from Set's perspective, as the lore descriptions for Osiris and Horus tell an equally bleak tale of Set as a ruler, but even so, it's refreshing to see a portrayal of Set where he gets a chance to voice his own argument, whose reasons go beyond just, "Mwahaha! I am evil!" Speaking of voices, let us appropriately move on to Set's in-game dialogue, through which he gives the impression of a resolute but embattled king, firm in his convictions and speaking from his experience seeing both kings and kingdoms decay. Befitting a god of the desert, storms, and destruction, Set mentions sand on a number of occasions, referring to it as an unrelenting force that buries the weak who lack the will to fight for their ideals. I also noticed that one of his joke lines has him mentioning that he wants to outlaw salads, because I only thought I could escape that story about the cursed ranch dressing from earlier. I can't even distract myself by redirecting this discussion to Set's bonus skins either, because there's hardly anything to talk about with them. That is to say, trivia that has to do with the root mythology of the character and might build off of that. What's on display here would majorly derail the discussion of the episode, and between that and needing time to scrub the tainted salad story out of my memory, I'm ready to make like Anubis and wrap things up. Today's episode definitely seemed like it was shorter compared to the past few, but really, length isn't as important as the actual content that goes into it, and I'm quite happy I got to check 3 boxes with this episode. Discussing a viewer-requested character, returning to the ever-fascinating legends of ancient Egypt, and getting to shine some light on one of the Pantheon's most complex and misunderstood gods. Although you can definitely argue that SMITE's depiction of Set still falls under the category of making the anomaly-headed god of disorder look menacing and evil, I want to commend the developers for at least letting Set speak from his perspective, something I can't immediately recall any other depiction doing. At least within the examples I'm familiar with. Hopefully this isn't an isolated case. Like I said at the beginning of today's episode, Set really does stand out among the Egyptian gods, and I hope I was able to explain exactly why. Unlike some of the more universally praised deities from ancient Egypt, like Ra, Osiris, and Horus, Set has instead lived a history full of ups and downs. Periods when pharaohs proudly bore his name, and periods when he was demonized and blamed for Egypt's suffering. The road Set has had to walk for so many millennia is not one for the weak of purpose, and the poetic side of me wants to read his portrayal in SMITE this way. Perhaps it's not that he's simply just evil, but more that he's had to endure an almost constant damnation by his former peers, one that has only strengthened his beliefs that Osiris and Horus were not the right rulers for Egypt. The gods know how to hold on to some serious grudges, and maybe all of that just further proves Set's point. Definitely makes you wonder, where's Apep when you need him? Do you reckon he'd be able to pull the Egyptian gods back together, just for a moment in time? With that food for thought, we've finally reached the end, so I guess you could say this episode is game, set, match. Come on, don't tell me you thought I'd go this whole time without making a pun out of his name.